how I handled the last few in a few or less. So, before I begin, I'd like to talk to you all about the weather, where the only time that the weather is of any concern is when the weather itself is changing. It is the tension between whether or not the weather will change that itself really only has direct influence on our plans, where then that is the only place in which we would hold the weather to be something we are against, is when the weather itself seems to be something that could interrupt what we have planned. Where when the tension itself breaks from there being cloud coverage into either clear sky or a rainy day, is the only time that the weather is of any concern, really. For when it begins to rain, or when the skies themselves clear up, the tension itself then breaks. And would we not say that anything that itself is in dealing with what we have planned is in regards to an amount of tension, which is in dealing with expectation, which then correlates to our own perspective of purpose within life. Then within this simple representation of a clear sky or a downpour is then a discussion about whether or not we feel like we ourselves are against something that is either with us or against us, that is either within our control or out of our control. And in dealing with such things, one could then compare the situation itself to trying to get something to come out of imagination, where the term itself is in direct conflict with its own resolution. That then itself can be used to represent the tension of the weather either clearing or simply then raining. Where getting something to come out of imagination is then saying that that is where it comes from, but we are trying to get it to come out of imagination, what means that it is no longer imaginative. What then these representations of tension can be either held within the dialogue as such, or then used to dismay the notions of there truly being any tension at all, if it is by these things that we have a perception of feeling that things themselves will interrupt our plans, our purpose, or come into conflict with our own sense of having a free will. So then, if it is this tension that holds our purpose, then when we feel this tension, are we then in the place by which there is purpose, which then can again be used to either say that if you are seeking something to be purposeful, then when there is this tension, then you are yourself at odds with your own sense of purpose. Where then, when there is this sense of things being purposeful, one can then simply relay themselves down to a gathering, as it were, of what their purpose is. To then say that if there are very strenuous terms of tension around oneself, then one can simply make a list of purposeful things within one's life. And then when making this list, qualified itself by the terms of tension that surrounds oneself, one can then see that in regards to one's own sense of purpose, the terms of tension itself is in no direct conflict with what one would even qualify as a purposeful state. Which is to then say that the mode of having free will or choice in regards to these circumstances would then qualify as another experience rather than the problem itself being with choice or with free will. Simply then an elaborate discussion on perhaps self-mastery or greed. If purpose itself requires this tension, and we relay these terms down to their basic beginnings, we see then that they are in no direct conflict with your purpose. Then if that is the case, you can then say that if you are to feel like there is no way going forward with your purpose, then the modes of tension that are being represented through forms of pressure outside of where it is that you call a comfortable zone, you can then say that if this is the case, then by an amount of reasoning, I myself can move freely according to an amount of these things which represent experience, that if these terms of pressure outside which are at a cost are to mean anything, then this also means something as well. Whereby then you can formulate a plan to move freely according to an amount of the meaning that is outwardly expressed to be in conflict with your plans by a representation of moving freely without cost. What itself will have an equivalent amount of meaning if the meaning of movement with cost outside of what it is that you call comfortable movement has any meaning at all, whereby then in which you've reached equilibrium with tension for anything to be either imaginative or to have come out of imagination. Then one can say that the processes by which one would feel are destructive within regards to one's own experience are only by an amount of processes involved. Where though if we represent experience within our own sense of these list of purposes, which themselves are diminished in the allotment of processes involved between the one who either causes them to move or notices them being moved with an amount of mind involved, then one can then say that the amount of process involved itself for anything to have an allotment of meaning in regards to an experience which itself seems to be destructive, then itself also houses an amount of conversation or dialogue, where then one can actually attribute an amount of destruction itself rather than in being destructive to then itself being demolition. Where then the whole process involved with anything that would seem to be a very influential experience which seems destructive is then simply something being demolished, what then gives a sense of intelligence to something being lost. Where then the only conflict that one would actually have with either seeing something being destroyed or in being demolished would then revert back to one's own experience with something that itself had a minimal amount of processes involved, with an amount of mind in mind, that one would then say that with whatever there was a minimal amount of processes involved with, one was speaking to something imaginative, trying to get it to come out of imagination. What then represents anything with a greater amount of processes involved simply relegated to this discussion at hand, where then when the process itself is then taken back to where there is minimal processes involved, one is then able to overcome the scenario in which the dialogue is extreme, for the amount of processes involved are very minimal. Then one can actually handle the circumstance of something either moving or standing still. Then, how is it that one can maintain a presence among things that themselves seem to be much more free than they are? And themselves still hold on to a capacity of having wealth itself represent terms of advancement. Where these terms of advancement themselves are better represented in being distant factions from what it is that we would call elemental, where the only term of advancement is power over the elements, though the elements themselves see value in what is distant to the elements, though the greater the distance from the elements is then the less impactful they are toward the elements. For do we not need to make contact with a thing to formulate another arrangement of it with more of it or with another thing? Then, in regards to these things, one can make more representations as to when it is that one would actually physically witness this representation of old and young, of advanced and primitive, where in which it is no problem in regards to arrogance or pride or a sense of self-righteousness to attain one's own inner desire in regards towards controlling something within their life, or feeling wronged in regards to the amount of processes that they themselves are a part of, that then when they witness these things that are freely moving, they feel wronged. Where if one is to say that you are not dismayed when seeing a cloud far off in the horizon, and yet it is out of your reach, then should one feel any more dismayed when these things are within a representation that themselves are not portrayed as being a cloud on the horizon? Where if we are to say that if things are to be young or old, that the more we feel wronged by either, according to the age of the thing feeling wronged, itself should have no problem in either listening to or saying that one does not need to listen. For the older a thing is, the greater the distance it is to it. So then by this, if any a thing is to say that it is what one should listen to by an accordance of age, it is then at odds with its being at a distance. Where then if the representations of age themselves come closer to one's being, then the representation of what one considers to be out of style is then no more of a discussion as to saying that one should use an umbrella in the rain. What then itself is derivative in regards towards discussion as to then where this tension of purpose is to be held, where the witnessing of things within one's vision that would represent age or youth to one's own perspective then relays back to the discussion of one either respecting their own sense of purpose, or then in trying to let something go, which then itself relays back to where it would be of no consequence, for the discussion is only held with oneself as to whether or not it is right to either let something go or to not. Where then, if that is the case, then in regards to whether or not one wishes to say that an umbrella isn't fitting for my outfit, in regards to the weather and it's raining, would then relay toward a discussion of one who is seeking an amount of attention, where then, if the whole discussion as to whether or not one witnesses a bear on the landscape before them, in regards to them being able to overpower the stipulations of what it is to be called human, in regards to whether or not one should tackle the bear or run away or witness the experience from within a tank, where then one could just relay the discussion to then being one of where one has a perception of nature within their own lives, which itself is only a perception from the place in which one has a sense of continuance. What then one could relay this sense of continuance with then a sense of greed. What then itself negates the discussion being solely about choice, when one navigates the waters of where one has a sense of continuance, which is brief, where according to the choices which one would have the perception of choice, for one to even say that there is a problem with choice, would then be represented in the place in which one would have this brief sense of continuance, which then in that place it is not represented as a problem. Where then a sense of value itself to then go into further discussions on greed, one would then need to delve into a discussion of whether or not things are a game. And does one value games? And if it is a game, what kind of game? And in regards to the kinds of games, is it then a good game? Where if we take our sense of value itself to the extreme, where there is a sense of loss of value, it then portrays another side, which the allotment of value itself, as said before, takes into consideration an amount of processes that are involved. It then allocates a notion to the fact that to the other side, in which one would then have a sense of losing, which then is diminished value, would then mean that to them it is just a game if there are any terms of advantage. Where then at this point, one can relegate the notions of severity in regards to any experience, if there is any sense of value at all to be lost or gained. Then, by in which one can relay this discussion in then regards as to where one would be at odds with, by one's own perception, they are being influenced by what is to them either young or old, by an amount of severity from either, to then their own amount of severity to what they perceive of as young or old. Where if then the notions of severity itself, through a perception of an interaction with what one perceives of as being young or old, there is then only either an ingraspable or cataclysmic faction that is involved if you don't know how to play the game. where if any cataclysmic action involved in regards to one's listening to or being told or through telling is at hand, is only by an amount of one's not knowing how to play, then one could always say to any of the factions up until the point in which they are either looking at a cloud, which itself would say nothing back, or at something by their own hand, which would say nothing back. Which would then be old or young truly to them. And then if this is the case, then when there is any sense of cataclysmic or incomprehensible, ingraspable circumstances, does then not one either have the right to make it a game, or to say, I don't know how to play, up until they themselves find their turn? Then that itself will relegate the nodes of calamity up into each end, where then if cataclysmic action is at hand, where then by which is an order of chaos, what itself then relegates furthering into it being a game, one either then is at odds with making it a game, or asking simply, what am I supposed to do in this game? Then it should find a way either way. Where then anyone who themselves would find themselves in a place that it would seem in which it is no game according to consequences by severity of either young or old, would then relegate one back to the discussion of finding terms of purpose, which then upon so doing, there would be no conflict with the tension itself that would be present within outside experiences, relegating a negative experience upon the one who was saying that through terms of consequence, they themselves were experiencing something that wasn't fun at all by inaction. Where then, according to the amount of these things, if then things are taken to an amount by which then things are then solid, there is truly no problem with then saying that one could then move freely according to an amount of external stimulus to give one the perception of their being in a negative experience. What then by which one could then say that the negative experience, if then things are solid, is known from before. What itself is a terms which defies itself as in such that the negative experience in which one relegates oneself to is known from something done before. What then would relegate a notion that the truth, according to justice and law, is then had as much to what it is that would do no harm, for by in this, if the truth is in doing no harm, then one would know from before. Then in this, one could then say that one could then move freely according to these terms, up unto a point of these terms. If one then feels they are at these terms, where any amount of reason itself, which would relegate a sense of consequence, would then only be had by an amount of reason, which itself would then be at odds with where personality would be the only condemning factor. If then attraction is by relation of reason, where you can only get hurt if you identify with something, where if the idea of attraction is only by its being something, then making it immovable is the same as leaving it. Where then by this, the consequence of action up into the point in which one would say they are having a bad experience would then relegate back to the discussion of where one would feel like the only one who truly they had to discuss as to whether or not to get rid of something was their own hand in regards to then being held by something. What then relegates an amount of reason through possession to then say that if possession is only through reason, then one can only argue up to the point of possession through a form of attraction, which itself, through the gradering of attraction, then simply denotes choice. What then relegates choice to anything that is a product of attraction to then make a decision of its whereabouts through reason. Where then the more reason for causation to allocate possession that is involved, then denotes a thing's coming from itself more so, what then itself diminishes notions of possession through reason.